Today, we're going to dive into the age-old question, why does the Western world call China, China, when the Chinese never called their country China, nor did they ever even call themselves Chinese? Before we get into all that though, let's understand what exactly the Chinese call themselves. In Mandarin Chinese, China is called Zhōngguó, literally Middle Kingdom. But this isn't just a name, it's a reflection of an entire worldview that shaped Chinese civilization for millennia. During the Zhou Dynasty, which lasted from 1046 to 256 BC, Chinese philosophers developed the concept of Tiānxià, or all under heaven. They saw their civilization as the cultural center of the world, surrounded by what they called the Siyi, the four barbarians, or four foreigners, in each cardinal direction, as in the non-Chinese. This idea of Chineseness led to the popularization of the name Huaxia, or beautiful grandness, as a term to describe the Chinese culture and ethnic identity, as well as other names too, such as Shenzhou, the divine state, as the Chinese felt their culture was strongly connected to the divine, and the more literal Jiuzhou, 9 provinces, referring to the main territories that China was made up of during those days. The name Zhōngguó did exist back then, but it was a nebulous term that changed with the times, sometimes referring to the central regions of the empire, sometimes referring to the imperial capital and its surrounding areas. When referring to the country as a whole, the Chinese mostly just called it the name of whatever imperial dynasty was in power at the time. It wasn't until the Song Dynasty of 960 to 1279 AD did Zhōngguó begin to be used as an all-inclusive name for the Chinese nation, culture, and people, and one that transcended dynasties. But if you've noticed, none of the names we've mentioned so far sound like China, do they? So what's the deal? Well, do you know what kinda sounds like China though? Qin. Qin was one of the belligerent kingdoms within China that emerged during the Warring States period of 475 BC as the Zhou Dynasty crumbled. But they weren't just any kingdom. They were a ruthless bunch led by one guy called Yingzheng, one of the most cold-hearted, iron-fisted, no-holds-barred dudes in all of Chinese history. And he absolutely steamrolled the other 6 kingdoms to establish China's first imperial dynasty in 221 BC, the Qin, and gave himself the title that you're probably a lot more familiar with, Qin Shi Huang, which literally means Qin's beginning emperor. Unfortunately, he only got to toot his own horn for 11 years before he kicked the bucket, and the dynasty went off the rails after that. However, while he was an absolute savage, he also had the brains to back up the brawn. He realized that to keep a massive empire unified, you had to literally get everyone to speak the same language. In his decade of rule, he standardized the way Chinese characters were to be written, created an official imperial currency, established consistent empire-wide weights and measures, connected the empire with an extensive infrastructure network of roads and canals, tore down the feudalistic political system, and rebuilt the government into one that ran on a centralized bureaucracy. And perhaps most importantly, for establishing a unified identity, no longer categorizing people as belonging to any of the other 6 kingdoms that he defeated. They were all called Qin. And so, even though the dynasty only lasted 15 years, these reforms created such a strong national identity that its name echoed through trade routes as foreign travelers, merchants, and diplomats encountered this newly unified empire. And they began referring to the entire region as Qin And now I will butcher, but I will get kind of close to what other old languages call China. Indian Sanskrit speakers call it Cīna. Persian merchants called it Qin. Arabic traders called it Sin. Greek seafarers called it as Thin. Early Europeans called it as Cin or Cīna. And there you have it, right? The Qin Dynasty's success at establishing national cultural cohesion led to the rest of the world remembering this new empire as China. Seems pretty straightforward enough. However, that's just one theory. Remember how the ancient Indians called it Cīna? Well, that came from the term Cīnam Suka, or Chinese silk cloth. And the militaristic brutes that were the Qin weren't known for making fancy things with silk. On the other hand, one of their old rivals from the Warring States period, called the Chu state, was absolutely legendary for extremely high-quality silk production. And guess what? This Chu state was also called the Jing, and one could very well argue that Cīna could have come from Jing'a instead. Makes sense. There's a problem. Few problems, actually. These Indian records were from around 300 AD, a good 500 years after the Chu state had disintegrated when the Qin Dynasty beat everyone up way back in 221 BC. On top of that, there was no political differentiation between states anymore, since everyone was forcibly unified under the Qin banner, remember? I guess you really can't vaporize a regional identity, but it definitely makes this theory a little less likely. Here's the kicker though. In 300 AD, guess which dynasty was in power? The Qin Dynasty. Maybe it wasn't Cīna or Jing'a, but Cīna. Great. Now there are 3 possibilities. Except, that's only half of the question. None of these have accounted for the fact that China is 2 syllables. Where in the world did the suffix come from then? Well, there is one more theory. See, there was also this ancient kingdom deep down in southwest China, much closer to India, called Yèláng, and they mostly stayed low-key and autonomous while dynasties like the Qin were busy rising and falling apart up north. Obviously, Yèláng doesn't sound anything like Cīna. However, even today, southern China is home to almost a dozen different dialects of Chinese. So imagine how many dialects there may have existed 2,000 years ago. And Yèláng, in the local dialect back then, is said to have sounded like Cīna. Bing bang boom, there it is, a nigh perfect match for the Sanskrit transliteration, right? Well, yes, but that doesn't explain the Persians, Arabs, and Greeks calling China the single syllable Qin, Sin, or Thin then. And so we return to our infinite loop of our initial question. What is the origin of the name China anyway? Well, if I may speculate, perhaps it was a little bit of all of those things together. The Persians, Arabs, and Greeks traded with China via land routes north of Tibet, and the first Chinese state they would encounter would be the Qin, whether it be the kingdom or the dynasty, and that would be their name for all of China after that. Now, the Indians traded with China via land routes south of Tibet, and the first Chinese state they would encounter would be the Yèláng or Cīna, and that would be their name for China after all of that and for forever, as these similar words and silks were traded around over the course of a 1,000-year-long game of telephone. The 2 variations got homogenized into what we now know as China. And so, long story short, all of these theories have their merits. But the ebb and flow of culture and civilization is rarely black and white, and the name China could very well be one of those gray areas where a confluence of causes resulted in what we have today. A name that doesn't entirely adhere to any one of them. And besides, does it even matter? China's real name is still Zhōngguó. We might as well be debating over the etymology of a nickname. Instead, it's probably a better idea to spend our time learning more about the person, in this case, the identity behind the name, rather than arguing over the name itself. And how better to do that than to learn Chinese now? Until our next cultural deep dive, thanks for watching. 再见.